Did you ever think Jesus might just know what he was talking about? Now, that may come across as a silly question. However, if you look in the Gospels, there were often times when people wondered if Jesus knew what he was talking about or not. One of the best known and well-loved stories in the Bible is one that many of us probably learned at a young age, the one you just heard, the story of the Good Samaritan. In this standalone parable, and why I say standalone is because this parable only appears in one gospel, the Gospel of Luke. Jesus summarizes 613 Jewish laws into two. Love God, love your neighbor. And this actually captures our Aldersgate United Methodist Church mission statement very well. To live and share God's unconditional love with everyone, make disciples, and serve others. We hope this new series on neighbors will help us live into our mission so we too will respond as did, can we say his name? The Good Samaritan. How well do we know our neighbors? Neighbors who live around us, on either side, front or back. That will likely depend on how long you've lived in your neighborhood, or in your townhouse, or condo, or complex. Some of you know most all of your neighbors, and you can easily fill in their names, their kids' names, their pets' names, work information, and more. I think I've heard others say they really just don't know their neighbors that well. And I have discovered that 70% of the members of Aldersgate United Methodist Church actually live within a 5-mile radius. And that's pretty unique for church life. In my previous appointments, so that you see the difference, people lived in a 40-mile radius. I must also say in my 2 previous appointments, we knew most all of our neighbors. But that didn't happen in just a few short weeks or a few short months. It happened over many years and with intentionality. So if you do know all your neighbors, I think that's something you should celebrate today. But I'm also aware people move in and out, so there's always going to be opportunities to reach out to new people moving in, greet them, welcome them, help them if needed, so that they can gain a sense of belonging and of community where they are. It's just that thinking about being a good neighbor can actually be a little bit intimidating to many, and why most of us know of our neighbors but really don't know our neighbors. Our culture does not help us love our neighbors either. Just watch the news long enough and suspicions grow and can cause us to be fearful and overwhelmed. A lot of people are buying new electronic devices such as Ring, and we actually got one for Christmas. Some other brand of doorbell or video technology to place on your front porch to capture people that are coming and going. In fact, a lot of those devices are being used to catch package snatchers, if you will, like around Christmas time, and you can actually see who's come on your porch and taken the Christmas gift that you bought for someone. Oh, as a matter of fact, yes, there is one on the front porch at the parsonage, so be very careful when you show up there. We'll see you. Actually, it's been helpful. But there are endless stories of shootings and burglaries and addictions and abuse, which tend to keep us at a distance and from getting too involved with anyone. After all, if you think about it, we have enough to deal with ourselves, right? How can we help deal with everyone else's problems? Or too often, like the priest and the Levite, we are far too busy to stop and lend assistance to somebody in need, even if they are dying. We just tend to be wary of strangers, and if we are honest, we teach our children to be wary of strangers too, and I think probably for some very good reasons. But today, let's focus on our true neighbors that live next door, across the street, on the cul-de-sac, maybe caddy corner, or down the hall if you're in an apartment complex. Your insert can actually help you with that today, and your insert looks like this. Everybody should have received one in their bulletin, and it's something that we hope that you will keep with you over the weeks that are ahead in our sermon series. This is called a block map. It kind of looks like tic-tac-toe. In fact, if you already started putting X and O's in it, I would understand why. That would be what my grandkids would do. Okay? But this is a block map, and the person in the center is you. Now, let me give you a little background. In 2012, Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon released a book called The Art of Neighboring. Their work arose with some pastors meeting and praying together to discern what they and their congregations could do to improve the city in which they lived. That group invited the mayor to come meet with them one evening, and they asked his opinion on that, and this is what the mayor said. The majority of the issues our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just figure out how to become a community of great neighbors. The mayor shared how so many tend to look to programs to fix the problems, but that's not always the most effective way. He said relationships are more effective than programs because they are organic and they're ongoing. The idea is when neighbors are in true relationship with each other, the elderly shut-in gets cared for, a ride is offered to the store or maybe to church, the at-risk youth gets mentored by a dad who just happens to live on the block or in the neighborhood. Ironically, what the mayor did was to invite those pastors to obey Jesus. What a novel idea. To really love and help your neighbor, to speak with them and maybe help them versus being so busy or so fearful or so important, we pass right on by pretending not to notice. Could Jesus, in this conversation with an expert in the law, have actually hit on something that would truly make all the difference? What do you think? In all honesty, Leanne and I don't yet know our neighbors. Well, we know one of them. She's sitting over here on the pew. In our first 6.5 months, we just haven't really gotten to know anybody. And part of that issue is we kind of sit on an island over here next to the church with a street of 6 houses that are just to our west and 12 or 13 houses on a cul-de-sac across the street. We see people coming and going, walking pets, bringing in the trash cans, but we don't know our neighbors. In my previous appointments, I can say, again in all honesty, we could write down the names of all our neighbors. I guess we have some work to do. And yes, we've already started on some of that. I'm aware a few of our neighbors intended to attend Christmas Eve services when we drop by some goodies for our neighbors on Christmas Eve morning. And oh, by the way, that's a good time to meet your neighbors because when people see you standing in front of their house knocking on their door with a little canister of candies or cookies, most people say, "Hey, thank you very much." They don't look at you and say, "What do you want?" Because you know that's typically what we would do most any other time of the year. Now, I can tell you a few last names now, but that's it. And remember, it's not just what we see in our neighbors, it's what our neighbors see in us. Leanne was out back shooting basketball in the fall there on the driveway, and that's not unusual. Leanne played basketball for James Madison University. And as she was out back, a couple young boys came up on the other side of our tall fence, not around the fence, mind you, on the driveway and up. So they yelled across the fence, "Hey, dude, we're collecting stuff in our boxes. Do you have anything to give us?" Now, that didn't bother my wife so much, but they, to them, thought my wife was a dude. The fence separated them from Leanne, and they presumed to know their neighbor. Have you ever seen Home Improvements with Tim Allen and Mr. Wilson's hat just on the other side of the fence? People do pay attention. When passing out candy, several neighbors mentioned they like seeing Christmas lights at the parsonage. So it's not just thoughts, images, or projections we have of our neighbors. It is also what they think, perceive, or stories maybe they've made up in their minds about us. Our big challenge over this 6-week series is that we become a really good neighbor, and not just for 6 weeks, but for a lifetime. To become a better, more loving, caring neighbor, willing to stop and help our neighbor as Jesus commanded us. Everything else besides for loving God is actually secondary. Love God, love neighbor. Will Willimon, a United Methodist bishop and past professor at Duke Seminary, says our biggest challenge is xenophobia. That begins with an X, xenophobia, which is the fear of the other. The word stems from the Greek word for stranger. In fact, if you think about the story of the sheep and goats that you find in Matthew 25, we hear a person praised and received into heaven with these words, "I was a stranger and you took me in." One version says, "You welcomed me in." Willimon encourages followers of Christ to act towards others as God has acted toward us. And maybe that's the most important line in the whole sermon today. That as followers of Christ, we are to act towards others as God has acted towards us. Scripture says at first, we were enemies of God because of our sin. Who took that first step to remedy that? Did we take that first step, or did God? God. God reached out to us in sending Jesus, who didn't come to judge us, criticize us, or condemn us. Rather, Jesus came to redeem us with radical grace, to love us and teach us and show us how to reach out to others just as the Good Samaritan did. We are called to show others God's grace and love and compassion, even if it does require a little bit extra effort on our part. Willimon says, our faith requires us to go towards the other without regard for whether the other steps towards us or not. And the truth is, when we do reach out to the other, we don't know what their response will be or why they may respond to us as they do. At the hypothermia shelter, another Aldersgate United Methodist member and I were together earlier this week. We attempted to engage a person in a conversation, and honestly, the other really didn't care much for that interaction. And I'm not sure why. But after a while, we attempted to engage another person, and she started sharing right away. I'm sure others could question, what do these guys want from me? Because we try to be interested in or care for others doesn't mean that will be received. We can only act towards others as God acts towards us. In mission work, I have seen so many people be grateful for help or guidance or involvement that they've received. But I've also seen some so angry from the hurt they experienced from me and my kind that the other was not in a place to be able to step toward me at that point. Jesus never promises that by my moving toward the other, we will actually bring out the best in the other. God just asks that we act toward the other as God acts towards us. I often wonder where these two religious leaders were headed when they come upon this man beaten and left half dead. I've often feared in my own religious work of being guilty of that as well. The lawyer asked a question. Who is my neighbor? After Jesus responds to his initial question of what he needed to do to have eternal life, the lawyer wants now to justify himself. We often like to try to justify ourselves. But when we do, that leads to inward thinking. If his neighbor is someone he can choose, then he'd be okay. He was looking for a loophole to make it easier. In the story, two religious leaders noticed the man and they passed by on either side. Ever run across the street when you saw someone coming your way that you didn't want to see or speak to? These two leaders prided themselves on doing what was right and were people who should have actually known better. But they had things to do, they had schedules to keep, agendas that couldn't be flexed, and potentially breaking one of those 613 laws that might have caused them to be unclean if they did actually stop to help a bleeding, dying man. The command to love God and neighbor is actually found first off in Leviticus 19:18. It was one of the 613 laws. But obviously they did not see that as a priority. And I would say, though I don't like to give these guys got an F. And you know what F means, okay? And at times, I've probably got an F as well. Though in my own spiritual growth, I do try to be more aware of or more responsive to the needs of both my neighbors and strangers. Finally, the Samaritan stops and helps the man. He was from a culture known for hating Israelites, and the feeling was pretty mutual. In the ears of Jesus' hearers, it would almost be like a terrorist stopping to help the man. Even so, Jesus says the Samaritan bandaged the man's wounds, loaded him on his donkey, took him to an inn, and he even paid the man's bills. How is that for adjusting one's schedule to help somebody in need? And as a side note, often it's just us making a little time to listen to the other that provides lots of help, lots of hope, and lots of healing. The twist is, Jesus turns the question. We might think the beaten man is the neighbor because it starts out that way. Who is my neighbor? The lawyer who despises Samaritans so much, when Jesus asks the question, who do you think was a neighbor to the man, answers, the one who had mercy on him. I want you to notice, he couldn't even say his name. He couldn't even say the Samaritan. Jesus doesn't criticize him for that. He doesn't wag his finger or make some other comment. Jesus simply says this: go and do likewise. Now, let's be careful here, because we often do say everyone is my neighbor, and to a degree that's true. But the thing is, if we aim for everything, we hit nothing. So what about those who really do live next door to us and around us? If we insist we are neighbors with everyone, we likely will not be neighbors with anyone. And we haven't come across too many wounded enemies lying in the ditch lately, have we? Jesus would hope we'd reach out to people we know and like and care for them. But now he was stretching their thinking, and he stretches ours as well, to include a group they didn't like, or maybe for us, someone who's not quite like us. So let's be careful not to turn this parable into a mere metaphor so that we have a metaphoric love for our metaphoric neighbors and think our communities will be changed, because they won't, only metaphorically. Today or this week, I want to encourage you to take your block map, begin to answer some of the questions that are written there at the bottom. Put your name in the middle. Think of your 8 closest neighbors, however that lays out for you. Put down their first name, then their last. Jot down any relevant information you know. Where did they grow up? What do they do? Something about their family. See how you do. Now, some of you may fill out the whole chart, and that's great. Some of you may get 1 or 2 blocks, and that's good too. Like me, you might not have anyone to write down. Just so you know what's normal about it, about 10% can fill in all 8 neighbors, about 3% can fill in a relevant fact, and less than 1% can fill in some in-depth information. And that's why this chart has become known as the chart of shame. Because all of a sudden we realize we really don't know our neighbors. But don't shy away from how this might make you feel. Instead, let's allow it to open our hearts and minds to what Jesus is asking us to do, to love our literal neighbors right where we live. And did you know, to love someone, it actually helps to know their name? And once you get to know their name, you get to know their stories. And once you know their stories, then you can really be good about how you pray for your neighbors. Back in Culpeper, I knew enough about my neighbor who moved in across the street when Charlie died to know my new neighbor did construction. I noticed his truck, and you can infer some things about your neighbors if you just pay attention a little bit and don't make up stories in your mind about them. A few times we talked about his business when we were setting out the trash. A few summers ago, I asked him to help on a Kelsey's Big Give mission project that required some real in-depth construction skills. And just in case there's somebody here today that doesn't know, Kelsey is our daughter that we lost 11 years ago in a car wreck when she was 17 years old. But she loved mission work, and that's why we established this. So I asked him to help on this big project, and he agreed to help. And as we continued talking, what I soon discovered that I didn't know was that a number of years ago, his younger sister had been abducted on the west side of Richmond. She'd gone missing for 4 or 5 days. And when she was found, her body was found dead in Goochland County, just west of Richmond. My new friend and neighbor, Rusty, had a reason to help with Kelsey's Big Give as he remembered his sister, and though not a church attender, believed helping others is what we should just be doing naturally. I learned of his story and he of mine and the grief and sorrow we shared, and he too decided to do something good to help others out of it. I don't think I would have known or learned that if the Holy Spirit hadn't prompted me to do something which is pretty uncomfortable for me to do. And that's to get out and know and love my neighbors. Honestly, I have a lot of work to do on this, and maybe you do too. But we're going to have some Sundays together ahead to keep learning. Together, let's learn what being a good neighbor and loving our neighbor really looks like, and how we can overcome our, xenophobia, and learn like Jesus taught us to reach out to others, love our neighbors, and to simply go and do likewise.